outsiders. They don't really feel like they belong. So we really believe it has to be at least 30% to have women feeling like they're a part of this field. And it's not just for women starting out in their careers. We're also working with women well into their careers, and we've seen that retention is also a really big problem, especially after about 15 years, and that's when the women are more senior, would be fantastic mentors and role models for younger women, but they're leaving engineering at much, much higher rates. So at the first, 15 years, it's about the same as their male counterparts. It's really in the later years where there's a marked difference. And finally, another challenge we're tracking. Has anyone seen this from the McKinsey Report? McKinsey and leanin.org, they prepared this report. Every year they do it, actually. It's a really great report showing that in the workplace, in corporate America, we have this huge challenge at every level of the pipeline where women are underrepresented, and increasingly underrepresented as they get to the senior levels. So the orange is women, men is in blue. It totals to 100%. And I wanted to point out that this is especially tough on women of color who make up of the workforce. This is about 279 companies, by the way, that were surveyed. About 17% were women of color at those entry-level jobs, and only 4%. So just a quarter of the pie of what they had initially. So a lot of challenges, and we started talking at Stanford about what we can do at ICME to change these pictures. And one area we looked at is technical conferences. We said, gee, we've all been to these conferences. I'm an engineer. I've been to many IEEE and other conferences over the years where it's not unusual to have 100% men speakers. And in fact, when I started a few years ago at Stanford, we had 2 events, 100% male speakers in data science. And when we asked the organizers, really nicely, did you consider having a woman on this panel or during this day? It was all well-intended. They said, gee, well, we tried to invite, and sometimes it was Fei Li they'd mention, or maybe one other faculty, but they couldn't make it. And then I'd wait for a pregnant pause, and that was it. They just didn't have anybody else on their radar. And so we thought, we can change that. There are a lot of great women at Stanford and beyond who are doing amazing work and just aren't getting their fair share of voice. So that's where we started when we were thinking about the Women in Data Science Conference. And I wanted to throw this out because I'm wondering if anyone knows what website, this was a conference a few years ago, what website this was from. Any guesses? Whoever said KDD, you get points, yay. So not to bash KDD, because these days, this year, it's fantastic. KDD is really aware that they need to have a wide diversity of people speaking. We've had many women as well as men keynotes this week. Many, many women speaking during the tutorials, during the workshops. But 5 years ago, the picture looked like this. And I'd say that in a number of other conferences that we've seen, that's a similar picture we still see today. And this is one of my favorite conferences or events, an example. This was just last year. Have you seen this before? I think it went viral because it's just such a crack up. But we're still seeing this challenge with well-meaning people, but they just don't have exposure to who is out there that they could invite. So we said, we're going to change all that. Now we have binders and binders of women. So by the way, if you have a conference or an event and you're wondering about who to speak and looking for a female, please call me or email or LinkedIn me. Okay, so that's where we started with WIDS, and we decided let's do a conference with a twist. We'll do a one-day tech conference and feature just women, rock stars in their fields, whether in academia, in industry, government, you name it, but we really wanted to feature the best out there across a wide variety of areas. And the goal was to inspire women at all levels in their careers, to educate everyone. And by the way, men are certainly welcome to attend our conference. We actually have a high percentage in some places of men participating, and we wanted to support women in the field. And that's where we started. And just 4 years ago in the fall, we had our first conference, one event at Stanford. We opened it up, and within 2 weeks, I think, we were sold out. So we were like, wow, okay, that's kind of exciting. We hit the fire code, so we couldn't allow any more in the room. And what was the real aha is that almost without us doing anything, no promotion, no advertising, we hit about 6,000 people who joined us on live stream. So that to us said that, wow, there's a lot of demand out there, and we started looking about how we can scale this. And we decided that rather than bringing everyone together, thousands of people, invite them all to Stanford, and that was one model we definitely looked at, we decided, why don't we just package up all this content and live stream and all the videotapes and any tools that we can put kind of in a virtual box, and let's share it with groups around the world so that they can host their own WIDS event in conjunction with the main conference and really make it meaningful in their local community, whether it's for partnerships or recruiting or education or all of the above. So that's the approach we decided to take. And then flash forward, we had our 4th conference in March this year, and we had over 150 events worldwide. So we've grown quite a bit in the last few years. We're actually on every continent. There's 50 countries or more that are involved. And I think we've hit all continents except Antarctica. So if you know anybody there who wants to live stream or get involved and have an event next year, please let me know. And then we had over, as Vani said, over 100,000 participants through these events, through live streaming, and then in some areas they took the videos because of the time zone differences, and they used the videotapes that we had produced of these speakers. So that's been really wonderful and kind of surprised us. It's been a great journey. What we heard feedback on is that they want to continue growing this throughout the year and through even more countries. And so I would say if you're interested, here's how it works. We have this wonderful, we call it WIDS Ambassador program. And basically these are people, men and women around the world, who decide they want to host an event. And it's free. They just sign a little form just saying that they're going to feature women speakers. And then we give them a lot of support and a lot of materials to make it happen. And then they can shape it the way they want to. And I think at the conference this week, we've had a number of WIDS ambassadors that I've met with. For instance, from Intuit has done a great event in Tel Aviv for the last few years. Microsoft has done an outstanding event or two every year, like one at Microsoft Cambridge, where they had MIT and Harvard all coming together with them, and that's been outstanding. And these are taking place all over. We had, in total, huge number of universities, companies, government groups, national labs, meetups, you name it. Sometimes they were working together, sometimes working on their own. Could be a private internal event or could be open to the public, so they could decide how they wanted to shape it. And so then beyond the conference, we heard that all these people involved wanted to have initiatives year-round. So we've been really busy building out this program, so it's not just a one day and then leave for the next year. So the first one we added is a datathon, and that is a predictive analytics datathon. We hold it in the 2 months or so leading up to the conference so that we can announce the winners and a lot of fanfare at the conference. We've launched a podcast series. We're just in our 2nd season if you want to check it out. I think it just was on the top 10 KD Nuggets list as new and notable in their data science field, so we're really excited about our podcast series. And that's a little more accessible even beyond a core technology group because it's audio and it's talking about careers, so we think we'll reach a broader audience, maybe even a younger audience with high school students and beyond. And then finally, education, which is really core in our goals. We've just started a high school outreach program where we're packaging up videos and discussion guides and all sorts of materials for educators in high schools to share, especially with young women, young girls, to say, hey, there's a lot of different paths you can take when you're in college that are very excited related to data science and AI. And if you want to join us on that, I'd love to share more about that with you later. So just touching on the datathon, our goal is to break down barriers here, because we've seen that most hackathons and datathons are really heavily skewed towards men. So we said, what can we do to change that picture? And first we said at least 50% women on each team. And that seems to have gone over really well. Some teams are 100% women, some teams are mixed. Secondly, we said that the challenge has to be around a social impact topic, and I'll tell you more about that later. We based it on the Kaggle platform, and I'm curious, are you all familiar with Kaggle? Anybody out there a Kaggle Grandmaster or participated at all in Kaggle? Okay, a few hands, that's cool. So Kaggle, basically, you prepare a data set, you clean it up, and you share it with people who have to use machine learning and deep learning techniques to predict what the ground truth is in the final state, and we withhold that data so we can see how close they get to accurate. And then there's a leaderboard, and it's really a nice thing to do in a worldwide exposure like this, where you can't really have judges around the world. That would be very cumbersome. But with Kaggle, it's very black and white. Whoever's highest on that leaderboard, most accurate, is the winner at the end of the competition. And then we've also held local events and a lot of groups from India to, I think, Bolivia to Spain, to IBM had an event, Microsoft had an event, UC Berkeley held an event. And these were events to bring women together just to train them on what it means to do a datathon so that they could feel comfortable participating. They might not have participated before. Okay, I mentioned our podcast and that we're in our second season there. We've just launched that. And then we're busy already working on the next conference. We always hold it around International Women's Day in March, which is rather fun. And please save the date. And if you want to get on the mailing list on our website, there's a link to join the mailing list. But we're going beyond that. And really where we're going is our aim, as I mentioned before, is really to have at least 30% women in all levels of the organization. And our goal is to try to do that by the year 2030. So we call it the 30 by 30 campaign. As I showed before, there's around 20% women in undergrad, in engineering, and in CS. And we're trying to reach 30% there, but at all levels, even at those higher levels where it really today drops off dramatically in terms of women and participation. Okay, so this is the social impact workshop. And when I was thinking about how our conference really fit with social impact, of course, we're trying to improve diversity and inclusion, but I think it goes beyond that. So I can share with you that when we started the conference, we weren't really thinking about social impact first and foremost, but what we discovered is that's really a key driver for a lot of women to be involved in the conference in one way or the other. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Maria Clave, president of Harvey Mudd. She is phenomenal. She spoke at Wits a few years ago, very, very inspirational. And in their CS department, they were able to increase the percentage of young women in that department from 10% to 40% within just a few years. And I highlighted my favorite part, which is that the courses emphasized how there was an impact or how they could benefit society. So I think that's really critical. We're also seeing at Stanford in the Clayman Institute, that's all about gender research, that there's this really interesting work going on about cultural frameworks. And in looking at those frameworks, they call it interdependence versus independence. And they're finding that women and people of color, in fact, are likely to be more involved and engaged in interdependence. And so for their own personal identity, social impact is a much bigger driver. And not surprisingly, we found that our most popular speakers at Wits are all about social impact. And so we're trying to get more and more in those fields. And so if you have any great speakers to recommend, please let me know. Here's a few examples. We've had two in privacy areas, LaTanya Sweeney and also Cynthia Dwork. both amazing keynotes in the last few years. Marzia Gassemi from UToronto spoke and did an excellent job talking about machine learning in healthcare, and actually some of the biases in the way studies have gone on in the past decades. Megan Price, who's with the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, spoke about the conflict in Syria and how they're trying to quantify the impact in terms of casualties. And we had Timnit Gebru last year talk about a study that now I think is really, really famous with Joy Buolamwini. They did a study looking at image recognition and how there was bias in that, particularly for women of color. And finally, a surprise one, Diane Bryant did an awesome job. She was a speaker from Intel the first year, and she really moved us talking about what Intel was doing to address Parkinson's disease as well as other diseases. So we continue to see this as a really big driver. And also likewise with our Datathon, we hear this as a compelling reason for women to be involved. So our first year, we worked with the Gates Foundation, and that was pretty cool. They had a recipient that had a survey in India on financial security for the poor. This past year, we looked at Planet Labs data, satellite chips. Those were 3-meter chips. And we looked at deforestation and palm oil plantations. So it was a great way to educate our community and also have everyone participating in. This was a classification challenge. And we had teams from, I think, 24 countries present and compete. And we got some great feedback. Over 50% last year of the participants had never participated in any sort of Datathon before. So we're really reaching a new audience. I think that's the impact here, and predominantly female. And I love this on the new skills in data science, because over a third said that was the most important gain for them. They also had a lot of other benefits of being involved. So the next Datathon that we're doing, I can't announce the data set yet, but we're very busy working with MIT, UToronto, and the West Big Data Hub in collaboration with Stanford. And this is on a healthcare data set, which comes with even more emphasis on ethics and privacy. And we're planning to work with Microsoft, and shout out to Vani, because we want to be able to share considerations about privacy with everyone participating through perhaps a webinar or a blog post or other ways to really make people more sensitive of the kind of data that they're dealing with and the implications. So I'll just leave with these few thoughts. As far as what we're doing, I think at the end of the day, this is really about changing mindsets. And so for women, especially younger women, what we're trying to do is show that they can really be empowered and have big impact if they go into areas around data science and AI in changing the world, improving our environment, really having a positive impact. And that there are many, many paths to be involved. So great if you want to be in CS, but we featured speakers from economics, astrophysics, Elena Graywall, who I think spoke here yesterday. She has an education background. We want to show people, hey, there are a lot of different paths into this field and ways that you can be involved, even if you don't feel like you're a core CS person at heart. And I'll share one story there, personal story. My daughter, who went through engineering recently, mechanical engineering, came home one day and said, you know, Mom, did you know engineers save more lives than doctors? I was like, wow, never really considered that. But it was really nice to hear, and something that was really important to her in going through engineering. And I think that's, again, the kind of mindset that we want to have. And then finally, we want to share with everyone how important diversity and diverse teams are when dealing with these large challenges and addressing these big societal issues that are impacting all of our lives. Really important for women to be at the table and have their voices heard. And then also we know from the studies that, and the research, that actually diverse teams lead to better outcome. So it's really a win-win there, and really important when you're designing for data, designing for algorithms. Okay, so if you want to be involved, and I'm hoping that you want to join our, we call it the WIDS movement, there's many ways to be involved, and we'd love for you to join us. If you want to sponsor the conference, that would be fantastic. I'd really appreciate it. Please let me know. If you want to host an event and be an ambassador, that would be great, and you can sign up online to hear more about that. If you want to host an event and really train younger women about a datathon, I think that's a great way to be involved, and or just participate yourself. You can check out our podcast. You can check out our YouTube channel. We have all these videos from the last few years. And you could work with us on the 30 by 30 campaign. And for starters, I always say, for starters, just measure where you are today. That's the best first step. But if you want to take the pledge for 30 by 30, I think that would be fantastic. So here's where to reach us and reach me, and I welcome all your thoughts and ideas and input on how we can all work together in this area. Okay, I'll open it up for questions.
Karen. Yeah.
Okay, great. Bonnie?
So question about WIDS Ambassador, what does that entail and what sort of resources are available if someone wanted to be a WIDS Ambassador and to create and sustain a community around the women in data science movement?
That's a great question, and we want to help as much as possible. So to be a WIDS Ambassador, you first fill out this very short form, just we're required by Stanford, but really it just says, I'm going to uphold integrity in the event, and I'm going to make sure to have all women speakers, and a few other things, minor things, but basically you fill out this form, and then you're connected, first of all, on Slack channel that we have with a whole worldwide network of these ambassadors. And then we give you all sorts of content, and we try to package it all up. So we give you branding content if you want to create a website. We give you materials if you want to do flyers. We give you ideas on best practices, what kind of events. Some people start their first year and have just a small internal event in their organization. Maybe they just invite a women in tech group that's already in existence at their company, in their university, to come grab a light lunch or breakfast and listen to the live stream. Really simple, doesn't involve much organization. We totally support that model. Some people say, we want to go to the next stage and we want to make this a more public-facing event. And so we give them registration. If you want to work on Eventbrite, we have a way to connect in with us on Eventbrite. We give them other tools that they might want to use, surveys afterwards, breakout session lists of topics that have worked for us. I'm happy to talk about speakers and kind of connect them with some interesting speakers that they might not be aware of. And then we also share videos, and we kind of highlight, gee, if you're in this field, maybe you'd want to live stream these particular speakers this year. So we have kind of a back and forth, maybe a conference call, or emails back and forth to help guide them and shape their event. Also, sometimes we see there's more than one event in a particular town or city, and that's totally fine. There's some places where we have 3, 4, or 5 different events. No worries. We let everyone know, so we might say, hey, you can connect with this person here, and maybe you want to combine your event or set it on different days. So I might add that you don't have to have the local events on the same date. Really, it's anywhere within, say, a 2 or 3 month window. We publicize your event, if you'd like us to, on our website. And they can have a link on our website so you can drive traffic that way as well as, locally. And we try to just give a lot of PR exposure to these events as well. So really, we try to do as much hand-holding as we can. We have a small core team of people really dedicated to supporting these global events. Yes.
Thank you very much for the great talk. You've presented very nice visualization, with the numbers and charts showing this distribution of the women over the years. and,
Yes.
and this drop in the like senior women and like overall women in engineering from 80s to the current time. Maybe if you could touch base quickly and maybe give materials for the homework regarding why. So why it is happening, what are the causes, and because I think that would be useful for us to understand the whys, so we can maybe change something.
I think that's a great question, and we certainly don't have all the answers. In fact, I'd love to have that kind of ongoing dialogue with people and share ideas and share what has worked and how some groups have changed that, like Maria Clave, who, for Harvey Mudd, that certainly seemed to be a key driver to have CS courses emphasizing social impact. We agree at Stanford, and in fact, I'm really excited. I'm going to be launching an AI for Good seminar series in this year at Stanford, featuring some very inspirational examples and applications of AI being applied in environmental, humanitarian, healthcare, smart cities, education, those areas. Our theory of change is that we'll get more young women enrolled in the class and actually more non-traditional CS students, I think, if we have that focus in the class. So we certainly think that's one area. We think it takes probably concerted effort, like those well-meaning organizers before. In their network, it's birds of a feather, so they just didn't have in their network thinking about all these other women, maybe on Stanford campus or beyond, that they could invite. And really what we want to do is highlight those rock star women, or just women at all levels who are doing great work, so that everyone is aware of them. And so when someone is designing an event, they can think about those people and not just go, oh, I only know one entire person who's a woman in this data science field, right? So we think that's really important. I'd love to continue the conversation. There's a lot of different things, I think, that are going on there. McKinsey has highlighted in their report, for instance, that the biggest issue is on the first promotion. So it's about 50-50 male-female in corporate America when they come in. But the first promotion, women go from 48% to 38% at the manager level. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done there, looking at how those promotions are handled. I mean, we know a lot of anecdotally that even though you might have great job reviews and performance reviews, at the end of the day, when people are discussing a promotion, it's like, hey, my buddy here would be perfect for this job. So I think a lot of work and a lot of focus is looking at that first promotion area in organizations and how we can address that. Those are just a few ideas. Like I said, we would love to hear your thoughts too. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, Karen. That was a great talk and certainly something that I identify deeply with. Continuing that discussion, many of us here in the room have experienced that data science does attract a lot of people who are interested in making social impact. All of you here in the room are clearly interested in this topic. But how do you really go from intention to impact? Our next speaker, Anisa Tanveer, has thought very deeply about how to reduce the messiness and complexity when it comes to doing good with data science. And I am very excited to hear what she has to say about the topic. Please join me in welcoming Anisa Tanveer from University of Washington.
Good morning. I just need 1 second to get my slides set up here. Is this, oh, there we go. Excellent. I love it when technology works. Okay. Okay, hi, good morning everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and a big thank you to Sarah and Bonnie for organizing this great session and inviting me to be here today to talk about the question of how we move from our good intentions to actually making an impact with data science. So about 5 years ago, I got involved as an ethnographer studying the Data Science for Social Good program at the University of Washington that's run by the eScience Institute. I'm now a research scientist there at eScience, and I've stepped into a very different role as the program chair, helping to run the DSSG program this year. So today I'm going to be sharing insights that I've generated in both of those capacities as someone who has been studying this phenomenon and now somebody who's deeply involved in the organizing aspects of it. Oh, it was working. Okay, there we go. Data Science for Social Good, or DSSG as we call it, is a summer internship program that trains both graduate and undergraduate students to do data science by way of these applied projects that are designed to have some kind of positive social impact. And typically we take on 4 projects per summer and 16 students. So each DSSG team consists of about 4 students, 1 or 2 project leads who are the people who proposed and designed the project, and then 1 or 2 data scientists who serve as technical mentors to those teams. And social good is right there in the name of our program. But how do we actually know that we are in fact doing good? That's actually a pretty hard question to answer for a number of reasons. First, social good is hard to define, or at least it's hard to agree on a definition, because what some people see as good, other people see as detrimental. Also, we know that there are typically winners and losers. So even if we do agree that something is good, the results aren't equally distributed, and some people's benefits may come at others' costs. Third, there are often unintended consequences, so there's always a chance that our interventions might backfire on us. And finally, there's often a lack of political will to actually make change. So it's really tempting to think that social problems continue to exist only because we haven't figured out how to fix them yet, but that's not necessarily the case. And because of all of these things, I sometimes think that maybe we ought to rename our program something like Data Science for Maybe Social Good, Data Science for Some People's Idea of Social Good, or Data Science for Less Social Bad. But of course, if we called it any of those things, probably nobody would want to participate, because people are really motivated to make a social impact, and they want to make the world a better place than it was when they came into it. But the thing is, we can't go around naively thinking that just because we intend to do social good, we actually are. So a known issue with technical solutions in particular is that they tend to ignore history and culture and context and politics, and therefore they often don't end up actually solving the intended problem and sometimes even cause new problems. And that's a phenomenon that we can call technological solutionism. And that's not an insight I came up with on my own. A lot of people much smarter than me have been talking about these ideas for a really long time, and I've included some citations here that you might want to look into. In particular, that third one, if you want a really quick and very beautifully illustrated introduction in under 15 minutes, I suggest you check out this video made by Khaled Qadir, and I even turned it into a tiny URL, so some of you have a chance of actually finding it on the web later. But anyway, I'm not going to be belaboring this idea because I'm actually taking it as the starting point of my argument, not my end point. So what I really want to talk about is why is it so hard to overcome that tendency toward technological solutionism in data science for social good in particular. And I'm going to argue that there are certain qualities that are particularly pronounced in data science that make it really challenging to overcome that propensity and actually make a positive impact. And those things are selective labor, domain agnosticism, and the reification of values. And I know there's a lot of strange-sounding and pedantic-looking words in there that require explanation, but just bear with me because I promise I'm going to talk about what I mean by each of those and tell stories from our program that illustrate why they pose challenges to making an impact in data science for social good. So, Selective Labor is an idea that Shoshana Zuboff developed in a book called In the Age of the Smart Machine. And she points out that information-rich societies and organizations heavily rely on a set of skills that include abstraction, explicit inference, and procedural reasoning. And she argues that in these information-rich settings and environments, labor essentially becomes synonymous with learning. And when that's the case, labor can't really be coerced or controlled or disciplined in the same way that more traditional forms of labor can be, because you can't force somebody to learn. So with Selective Labor, people need to be incentivized to work on problems that are inherently interesting to them. So that sounds a lot like data science, right? But why in the world would I say that this is one of the challenges of moving from good intentions to positive impact? Well, in our program, we've sometimes seen that this intrinsic motivation to learn can come into tension with the goals of the organizations that we work with, who are the change makers and implementers on the ground. So, for example, this year we're doing a project related to the issue of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, which are also sometimes colloquially called mother-in-law apartments. So these are separate, distinct living spaces that are added on to a property in a larger single-family home. And so the city of Seattle is currently encouraging people to build ADUs because they think it will increase the availability of affordable housing, which Seattle really desperately needs at the moment. And so the city's recently changed a lot of regulations to make it easier for people to build ADUs, but they also figure that there's this important informational gap that's a barrier as well. So homeowners don't know if their property has the right characteristics, they don't know how much it would cost to build one of these units, and they don't know how much they could charge if they rented the space out. And so that's where our program comes in. So, a city planner and an architecture professor came to us and proposed a DSSG project that would bring together a bunch of public data sources like parcel data and environmental data and economic data to build a tool that would help homeowners determine if it's feasible for them to develop an ADU on their property or not. But when the students on the team got to the program this summer and they got their hands on the data, in the first couple weeks of the program, they were coming up with all kinds of ideas of where they wanted to take the project, doing things like forecasting when and where ADUs were likely to be built. So things that were intellectually curious to them and would have been mathematically and technically challenging, but were pretty different from the city government's idea of what they thought was really needed in the space. So there was nothing wrong with what the students wanted to do. It's just that there wasn't as straight a line between those ideas and something that would actually be put into use by the city and that they thought was really needed. And this isn't the first time that we've seen kind of a dynamic like that play out on our teams. So we run a training program for students, and we want them to be empowered and engaged. So the tension between learning and impact is particularly pronounced in our program. But I think it's present in other kinds of settings where data science for social good type work is taking place, because as we discussed, the labor of data science is really synonymous with learning. And data scientists, by and large, want to be working on interesting questions and challenging technical problems. But it just so happens that the people who are actually out there deciding policy and implementing programs don't necessarily always need what's most interesting or challenging to data scientists. So what did we do in that situation with the ADUs? So the leadership on the team decided that they would let the students explore all these different angles they were interested in, and in the meantime, they were bringing the team up to speed on what was happening in the ADU policy world. So they went to a city council meeting where they listened to public comments on different sides of the issue. They went on a tour of ADUs and met with owners of those units. They met with the Seattle Planning Commission. And in the process of all of that, the students' vision started aligning more and more closely with the vision of the team's leadership. So they started to think that the most fruitful path forward was pretty close to the one that had been originally proposed. So by getting their hands dirty, by interacting firsthand with the people and organizations who are most intimately and immediately connected to the issue, their own interests became more grounded in what would be feasible and impactful in the real world. So I think that kind of engagement offers a promising way forward for balancing the curiosity of intellective labor and the need for impact. So the next data science quality I want to talk about is what I call domain agnosticism. And by that, I mean that data science is seen as a sort of universal approach with tools and methods that can be applied to pretty much any manner of question in any context. And that opens the door for a lot of really exciting cross-disciplinary applications. For example, a few years ago, we had a couple astronomers in the program working on data that was related to homelessness, and they ended up taking a clustering algorithm that they had used for grouping galaxies together and adapting it to determine what constitutes a family in a data set of people experiencing homelessness. And one of the data scientists on the project told me later that when they presented that particular analysis to their partners in government, one of their collaborators started applauding because they thought it was so cool that they would be using methods from astronomy in this line of work. So moments like that are really celebrated, and they make data science a very exciting cross-disciplinary space to be working in. So why would I say that that poses a challenge to moving from good intentions to impact? Well, for one thing, it means that you have a growing number of researchers with computational skills working in unfamiliar disciplines and domains and problem spaces. And when data scientists are working on questions that they don't have a deep contextual understanding of, they can easily end up with findings and solutions that are untenable or socially objectionable, or they might just miss out on opportunities to make an impact. And something like that happened a couple years ago on one of our projects. So this one was geared toward analyzing transaction data of our regional electronic fare payment system, which we call the ORCA card. And all four of the students on this team were social scientists who came into the program with a major concern for social equity. So what they were really hoping to figure out that summer was whether if they could use the data to look at whether the transportation system as a whole was serving different demographic groups in the city fairly or not. But they didn't end up actually addressing that question because they didn't think they had the data they needed to answer it. But as a researcher observing this in retrospect, I think that they potentially missed out on an opportunity to do that very work that they were most interested in. And I want to talk a little bit about why that happened, because I think it speaks to this issue of domain agnosticism. So back in 2015, the Seattle region introduced a program called ORCA Lift, which is a reduced fare transit card for people who meet a certain low income threshold. So the card looks just like this one. It's identical to the regular ORCA card, but people who are in the ORCA Lift program pay a significantly lower fare. And the DSSG team's data included both the regular ORCA transactions and the ORCA Lift transactions. And at one point, they were considering doing an analysis that would compare the two of those. But the students ultimately passed on that opportunity. And this is why, as one of them put it, they said, if you actually have a good way to statistically test for it, then the evidence will more than likely show that there are differences between different types of ORCA users. From an analytical point of view, of course they're different. That's why they use different passes. For us, that wasn't particularly interesting. It's like, this is what we already knew, and doing that would give us the evidence to back it up. So the students didn't really see a connection here between their goals of making an impact on social equity in the transportation system as a whole and the data that they had available to them. But I think if they had understood the history of the low-income fare program, they might have thought about it a little bit differently. Because it turns out that activist groups in the Seattle area had spent years advocating for this low-income fare. And when it was finally introduced in 2015, it was only the second program of its kind in the country, and it was really celebrated as this major grassroots victory. So one can imagine that the organizations who had fought so hard to get this victory would be really eager to know how the program was panning out and what the data could tell them about how low-income riders were being served by the transit system. So for example, are the bus routes that are heavily used by low-income Orca Lyft users more crowded? Do they run less frequently? Are they running late more frequently? Do low-income users have to transfer more often? But I think the students didn't really see that potential, the potential to ask those questions, because they didn't come from backgrounds in the specific problem space of transportation equity. And you can see that reflected a little bit here in this photo. So this is a shot taken from a stakeholder mapping exercise that we always have the teams do every year, where they identify all the different stakeholders in their projects and they talk about risks and benefits to those different groups and explore the power dynamics between them. And this team identified these very broad categories of stakeholders, like people that need to get somewhere, or commuters, employees, researchers, but very few specific organizations with questions, expertise, and perspectives that could meaningfully impact the trajectory of their work. So they didn't seem to be familiar with the history of the low-income fare program as the grassroots victory that I've said it is, and they weren't aware of the existence of the advocacy groups that played key roles in that victory. So naturally, they couldn't imagine ways for this data to be useful to stakeholders they didn't know existed. But I really want to stress this next point that I'm making because it's really important. So when I say that the students didn't recognize the potential for this data set to address the equity issues that they were genuinely really passionate about, that's not in any way a critique of them as individuals. Because our program very intentionally brings together researchers and students from dramatically different disciplinary backgrounds with no prior expertise in the subject matter of their projects. So by design, most of the DSSG students are just not familiar with the political and historical contours of the problem that they're working on. And the structure of the DSSG program, I think, reflects this broader culture of domain agnosticism that I'm arguing is a hallmark of data science practice. So the belief that the tools and techniques of data science are applicable and transferable across domains and problem spaces. So what can we do about that? We realized that just having the teams sit in a room and speculate isn't necessarily enough because their imagination is really constrained by their own experience or inexperience with the issues at hand. So we've done a couple things in our program. We now require teams to get out of the studio and do field research and site visits and stakeholder meetings. And we also have brought on a human-centered design mentor on our staff who helps the teams think through these issues and prepare them for those experiences and kind of guide them through the process of learning about the history and the present of their projects. Okay, so the final quality of data science I want to talk about is what I'm calling the reification of values. And what I mean by that is that when we turn anything into data, we're creating categories and classifications that attach particular values and perspectives to that data, and that those values and perspectives get more and more entrenched as the data is used. And so I think it's probably best to just illustrate that with an example from our DSSG program. So for a couple years in a row, we supported this ongoing effort to build something called the Access Map, which is a routing application that's tailored to the needs of people with limited mobility. So while Google Maps assumes that you want to know the quickest way to get from point A to point B, if you have mobility limitations, that might not always be the case. So the Access Map routing algorithm considers information like where curb ramps are present, where sidewalks are closed due to construction, and how steep the incline of a sidewalk is. And at one point, the team had to decide how they were going to account for street furniture, like benches, in their routing algorithm. So what kind of cost function should be associated with objects like this? If a bench narrows a sidewalk, maybe it should be considered an obstruction for someone in a wheelchair. But what about for somebody walking with a cane who needs to take a brief rest? Perhaps to them, that bench is an important amenity and not an obstacle. So the Access Map team knew that they would be encoding and elevating one particular perspective over another, depending on whether they chose to represent the bench as a barrier or as an amenity. And so it's a great example of how something that most of us probably think of as just this neutral and innocuous feature of the world gets translated into values and then baked into data-intensive systems. And this poses a challenge to making an impact when we try to do social good, because if we're not really intentional about it, we might accidentally end up reifying the wrong values. And that decision the Access Map team made about sidewalks and benches was just one tiny example of the dilemmas they faced in things like how to represent sidewalks and curb ramps. And I don't have the time to explain this chart in its entirety, but the important point is that with each decision, they had to consider and balance different values that were priorities to different stakeholder groups. So they valued relevance for the targeted users of the Access Map, people with limited mobility. They valued interoperability for tech developers like themselves. They valued computational efficiency for OpenStreetMap, which they plan to use as their base layer. And they valued intuitiveness for the volunteers who would crowdsource a lot of the data they needed. And what this chart is showing is when and how those values were in tension when it came to very specific decisions that the team needed to make about their data. And I made this diagram as part of an analysis I was doing on their project, but it's based on these very detailed and nuanced conversations that I heard the team having with each other while I was observing their work. And so all of these issues and questions were very much on the surface for them, and they dealt with them really transparently. And we actually ended up even writing a paper together about a lot of these choices. So I think the lesson to be learned from the Access Map team is that we need to take the time to make our values really explicit and to argue and debate and explore all the options instead of just going with what seems the most obvious at first. So I've argued today that there are some inherent aspects of data science that pose challenges to moving from our good intentions to making a positive impact. I've told some stories about how those challenges have come up in our own DSSG program, and I talked a little bit about how we've tried to address those challenges with the design of our program. And I think that the common denominator across all of that, the really overarching takeaway is that we really need to fully embrace the social complexity involved in trying to do data science for social good. So we need to lean into that messiness and difficulty. And some of the things that means to us are that we need to be systematic about the way we analyze social complexity. So it's not going to happen spontaneously. We need to provide data science teams with the scaffolding to make this happen. That means setting aside time to do the work and introducing different kinds of processes and expertise into the workflow of data science. So for example, I talked about how we teach people how to do a systematic stakeholder analysis, and we've assigned a human-centered design mentor to the program to work with them on these issues. Second, it means getting stakeholders involved, because this work is so wrapped up in so many layers of social complexity. Your data science team is never going to have all the answers and all the knowledge and all the perspectives that they need. So it's really essential to seek out the perspectives of people who are most familiar with the problem space and most impacted by the work. And we've had projects that have done this beautifully, and we've had projects that haven't done it quite as deeply or fluidly as others. And I can tell you that everyone has a better time, and the projects are more sustainable and more impactful when stakeholders are meaningfully involved. And then finally, just being really explicit about trade-offs. So don't try to sweep stuff under the rug or try to smooth things over. Be upfront about the choices that you make, both within your own team and beyond, and document those choices. And this can be a little anxiety-inducing because it means going through a phase of uncertainty where you're questioning all of your assumptions, and because it means spending a lot of time talking and not coding. And that's true for all of these things generally. A lot of this work isn't the work that we typically think of when we think of data science. It's not writing code, it's not munging data, it's not running statistical packages, it's talking and deliberating and getting out and interacting with people. And I think if we do a lot more of those things, we have a much better shot at turning our intentions into impact. So Thank you all, and I know we're running a little bit behind schedule. I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Sarah, Bonnie.
We can take a question if anyone has one. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So have you thought about the interdisciplinary nature of teams in the stakeholder engagement part of what you talked about, and how that affects some of the programmatic elements of what you do?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Interdisciplinary versus teams that are not interdisciplinary. Do you have any observations?
Would that be a better way forward, to just really try to build teams that already have that deep expertise? I think it's a little bit of a balance, because at the same time that what I talked about, that how the gaps in knowledge can pose a challenge, I also think that bringing different perspectives to bear on the issue also can be really advantageous. So I do think that there are really, like that example I told about using the clustering algorithm from astronomy on homelessness data, like that's a great moment, right? And so we do want to foster interdisciplinarity for that reason. So I wouldn't want to ever just say, okay, if we're working on a public health issue, we're only going to take students from a public health background. But I do think that finding ways to integrate that domain expertise into the project is really important. And so one of the things we do, we have, which makes our program, I think, a little bit different from a lot of other data science for social good programs. The people who propose the project become project leads in our program. So they commit to spending at least 16 hours a week during the summer of working side by side with the students. So they're not just some distant client that we report to at the end of the summer, but they're bringing that deep domain knowledge to bear on a day-to-day basis in the projects. So I think that is the way forward, like embracing the interdisciplinarity, but also finding ways to really meaningfully integrate that domain expertise at key moments is important. Okay, I think we're just going to take one more question.
Have you considered not just bringing the stakeholders, but also bringing the population, which is it's meant for?
Yeah, I'm considering them to be a stakeholder. Yeah, we think of stakeholders really inclusively in our projects. So not just, we talk about direct and indirect stakeholders. So the direct stakeholders are the people who actually have a role to play in your project, but the indirect stakeholders are maybe the people who aren't involved in executing the work, but are affected by it and implicated by it, and we do try to find ways to bring them in as well. But I will say it's challenging. We are constrained by having a 10-week long program, right? So I think a part of the solution to that is making sure that we're plugging into ongoing efforts. Like, we don't have this idea that you can start a project from its inception and have something that is fully packaged and ready and going to change the world in 10 weeks. So we try to work with partner organizations that have been deeply involved in the work leading up to that point and will continue to carry it on, because then they already have those relationships to the affected populations and stakeholders that they can then bring in. Otherwise, I think it's really hard in just 10 weeks to make those connections and reach out and build relationships with all of the affected communities. So that's one way that we try to do that. Yeah, thank you. That was a great question. Okay, I think that's all we have time for, so I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie.
So most of us who care about social impact also care about open data, open science, and open source. Our next speaker, Robert Monroe, has extensive experience in the tech industry, and he has thought about the ethical considerations in open sourcing machine learning models. Just a quick housekeeping announcement. We have a break from 9:30 to 10, and we're going to borrow maybe 5 or 7 minutes from the break because we're running a little behind schedule, but this next talk is a short talk. So please help me welcome Robert Monroe. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Vani. So it's wonderful to be here today and to follow a couple of really good speakers. Thank you very much, Sarah and Vani, for creating the social impact track here at KDD. I've always appreciated how KDD is a conference that really spans academia and industry. And I think the third pillar in technology is thinking about social impact. So my talk today is about open source and machine learning models. There's been a lot of concern recently on the back of generalized machine learning models, especially in natural language processing, where they can do things like generate fake news at scale. They can create deepfakes, so videos which are completely synthetic but look like maybe a celebrity or a politician saying words that you literally put in their mouth. And this has led people to be rightly concerned. So if you're able to create a model that can be used for some of these negative purposes, maybe you might choose not to open source that model. You might go against the typical trend in academia of being as open as possible with your data and model. And so I'm going to talk about the kind of questions that you need to ask yourself if you are thinking about open sourcing your model. And this is a rewarding talk for me to give. I've spoken at KDD a number of times in the past, and it's always been from an industry or an academic perspective. So I ran product for AWS's first natural language processing and translation services. I've been a founder or executive at a large number of AI startups, and I got a PhD at Stanford. And a lot of this work that I've been doing throughout my career has been in areas in health and disaster response, like these listed up here. And they've always ended up being the footnote of the talks or papers that I've given over the years. So I thought it was right to revisit a lot of these use cases where I've thought about open data and machine learning, working in health, working in disaster response, and make that the focus of the presentation. So if you looked at the media, you would think that no one had ever thought about the problem of open data and danger in AI before. A lot of it is being posed as if it's a new problem. And there are certainly new problems that we do face with the ability to generalize AI. But honestly, I think 90% of the concerns that we have with open source models today are the same as what we have already been tackling with open source data, especially around potentially exposing person identifying information. And so it's important to, for one, for that 90%, look at the lessons learned. What have we been practicing in open source data? Where can we do better? And implement those practices. And then really laser focus on that 10%. What is new and dangerous about open source models that we haven't seen before? What deserves the most attention from an ethical point of view? And so, like it says up here, PII is the main thing that we worry about with open source models. If you can reverse engineer a model, a lot of the time you can get personal identifying information out of those models. However, it can be harder in some cases to do that with a model than it is with data. So it's a gray area, but there is a little more security than with open source data. And one of the biggest differences is that it's now orders of magnitude easier to implement some of these negative use cases, like generating large volumes of varying fake news. And that's very separate from the kind of concerns we had with open data. So I'm going to go through a number of factors that you should consider if you are going to open source or thinking about open sourcing your model. So the first and most obvious one, should you open source your model just because everybody else does? Just because it's a de rigueur in your academic field, you should always question whether or not to open source your model. Just because it's the standard in your industry does not necessarily mean it's the right thing to do with your particular model and data. So you should always ask these questions. Probably the biggest thing that I see people getting wrong is if you built your model on open data, is it therefore okay to release that model openly? And the short answer is no, it might not be. Aggregated data can be sensitive even when that non-aggregated data is not individually sensitive. And you can think of a machine learning model as a form of data aggregation. So this is something I saw when helping track refugees and internally displaced people during the Arab Spring. So we were helping the United Nations try to identify large groups of refugees and people who are potentially at risk. And as part of this, we were looking at social media and harnessing, or like harvesting rather, tweets from individual people. And they were reporting things like, oh, the road is closed in my area. And so if it's someone with like 20 people following them on Twitter or some other kind of social media, and they say, oh, the road is closed here, they're really just reporting what they're seeing locally. But if you aggregate that and you have 10 people in an area reporting that different roads are closed, that's no longer just reporting a road's closed, you're probably reporting that there are military movements in this area. That's why these roads have been closed. So by taking these individual pieces of information, aggregating them and taking them from being shared with friends to being on a United Nations, like a branded website, we made these people appear to be collaborators with the UN, which by some people was viewed as an interruptive, a disruptive, a negative foreign invader. And so the systems that we used for this were repeatedly attacked, and we assumed some of them were compromised by bad actors within the Middle East and North Africa. And so it's really taught us a valuable lesson that you can't just take already open information and re-aggregate it or recontextualize it without also considering the potential negative consequences. And this is something that's done in a lot of industries already. So if you know the Medium Publishing Company, they already have policies against aggregating data to make something that was previously non-sensitive sensitive. Standard in the military as well. Military organizations will treat individual data points as non-sensitive and then reevaluate if there's any aggregated data. And sometimes even the military slip up. So you might have seen a story recently about Strava, the running app, which tracks where you run. And so it turns out a lot of people in the US military were serving in bases, which weren't meant to be publicly known. And you could look at heat maps of where Americans were jogging in countries that the US military was occupying and get the outline of those bases because they were jogging around the boundaries. So this is, like I said, probably the most important thing to consider. How is aggregated information in your models different from the individual data points? So how should we evaluate risk? So I think there's a really good analogy in the security industry. If you know people who work in security or cryptography, they generally go by principle of we'll publish exactly what the algorithm does. There's not many people in security who think you need to hide what the algorithm is for encryption. You publish it, you understand the strengths and weaknesses, and then you don't think that anything is breakable. You try to make something so strong that the value of breaking that cryptography would cost more than the value, the perceived value of whatever it is that you're protecting. So we can think about our machine learning models the same way. If there is some level of PII in your model, what is the cost to reverse engineer that to get that PII out versus the value that someone might perceive in the model itself? So this is a nice way of, rather than trying to impose black or white, think about that gray area and weigh up the positive and negative risks. A lot of people recently have deferred to journalists in talking about open source models. So certainly journalists do have a long history of thinking about what data they can share and what they can't. But it's not the same as treating them blindly. A journalist will have different motivations, different agendas to you as a researcher or a practitioner in machine learning. And they might not necessarily be aligned. Journalists will often tend towards being more sensational and therefore more open. So this picture here is actually from a clinic that I worked at in Liberia right before I moved to the US to start my PhD. And this ended up being one of the centers for Ebola treatment in the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So at the start of that outbreak, because I'd worked there in the past and helped set up a NGO that does a lot of the power for clinics in that region, we were able to do estimates on who was not going to hospital for fear of the Ebola outbreak. and estimated in advance, and it was confirmed by the Ministry of Sierra Leone afterwards, that for every one person who died directly from Ebola, 10 more people died from treatable illnesses that were avoiding clinics for fear of contracting Ebola. And so we advised media organizations in advance, both in the country and internationally, not to sensationalize Ebola, to understand that, look, it's not an airborne illness, it's actually fairly hard to contract, and it's going to do more harm than good if we create a big media circus around that. Obviously, that advice was ignored, unfortunately. And so because of the misjudgments of journalists about the social impact of what they were reporting, we lost 10 times as many people as we needed to during this outbreak. So certainly you should think of journalists as stakeholder in decisions around sharing data and open sourcing data, but know that you're not necessarily aligned. If you are working with journalists, then there are ways to ensure that they are giving the right message. So one of the most important things that you can do is just get media training. A couple of hours of media training are enough to make you be able to respond to journalist questions in a way that promotes your agenda and not theirs. And the single best tip is if a journalist is asking you about your model, you ask them what their story is about. If the story is about advances in machine learning research, that's probably good. If it's about killer robots, then it doesn't matter what you say. It will probably get manipulated to suit their story. So you have one takeaway for thinking about how to talk about your model with journalists. That would be the main one. So similar to journalists, you shouldn't necessarily trust governments to make decisions for you. So this is the border of Sierra Leone and Liberia. During that Ebola outbreak, Liberia was under a lot of pressure for looking like they weren't doing enough as a government to fight the disease. And so they closed the border. So this is, it's an artificial border. It was like drawn up as a colonial border. There aren't fences or walls. It's just a series of trails and rivers through the forest. So it was, pure performance that the border was closed. People still moved back and forth just as they ever did. But it created this sense of fear and panic around the border, which again drove people away from visiting clinics, moved them out of traditional transport corridors where people could be more closely monitored, and ultimately made the decision worse. So just as journalists are not necessarily aligned with you, and when you're thinking about open sourcing your model, you should treat governments in the same way. Seventh factor to consider, should you investigate the negative use cases from your model? So yes, absolutely. So if you have a model and you think that it can be used to generate fake news, then you should also consider, how easy is it to identify this fake news? Can I build a separate machine learning model that can distinguish real from fake news, and how successful is that? If you can be transparent about the ways to combat the negative use cases, both in the positive and the negative, then this will factor into your decision about whether to open source a model and allow future researchers to make an informed decision as well. Other factors to consider, so is this a problem in machine learning? So, no. So, concerns about PII in machine learning have been around for a very long time, especially related to identifying at-risk individuals in disaster response contexts. So in 2014-15, on 3 separate occasions, I had the Saudi Arabian government approach me to try and help them build a Twitter monitoring system to find people who are unhappy with the government. And the stated use case was to help give them a voice. Consulting with a lot of people from Saudi Arabia and who had worked in humanitarian missions there, we ended up pretty certain that this wasn't to find people and give them a voice. This was to find dissidents and to silence them. So working with domain experts, we were able to identify that this was a negative use case that we weren't going to participate in. And the same should apply for any potential use case that you see today. Work with domain experts and try to identify what the real use cases might be if they're not what you think might be the stated use case. Fake news is not a new problem as well. Again, the media makes it sound like we haven't had large-scale propaganda before. Propaganda has been around as long as language has. And even today, in a lot of the world, broadcast radio is the main source of fake news. So when I worked in election monitoring in Sierra Leone, a lot of pirate radio stations were set up falsely broadcasting violence by people from different political parties. That was about 10 years ago. In the most recent elections there, I saw exactly the same information being spread this time on social media. And so this same propaganda is out there. One of the biggest differences, though, is that if there's fake news in English, you have a lot of different resources to go double check this. You can check a dozen different media organizations, like maybe Wikipedia is up to date. You have a lot of resources available to you. If there's fake news in a minority language, there might not be that same variety of information. So this is something that is very unequal, depending on what particular language you're speaking or writing or signing. 10, security industry, where you are transparent about the strengths and weaknesses of different cryptographic algorithms. You can be the same about the potential uses or misuses of your machine learning models. So I recommend that you build on what are known as data statements. These have been popular in the linguistic community for a while and have been recently proposed to be part of every natural language processing paper, just recently presented by Bender and Friedman. And so I won't go through these today in the talk. I'm happy to chat with you afterwards, and please have a look at the paper online associated with this talk. If you can spell out where your data comes from, what languages it contains, what's the intended use, what can your model do right off the bat, what can it be adapted to do, and what are the resources required, then this can inform your decision about whether or not to open source a model, and anyone who can take your model, it can inform their decision about the potential strengths and weaknesses. So in conclusion, yeah, there's a lot of best practices out there already that we've learned from open data. The security industry has given us some good examples about being transparent about the strengths and weaknesses. And if anyone would like to talk more, I know we're short on time now, so I won't take questions and keep everyone from their coffee. But I'm happy to chat individually afterwards. Thank you.
So we'll go to break now, and we'll start back here at 10 o'clock.